When you think of the ancient Romans or ancient Italy, one of the first things that often come to mind is the word villa, perhaps due to the high number of ruined Roman villas that were open to the public for days out. However, this only applies to a small part of Roman life. A villa in the Roman sense is more likely what we would consider a country estate. Villas were owned by rich Romans or members of the aristocracy. The fields and vineyards worked by slaves and the produce was sold for profit. In a few words, villas were in the business of agriculture. Before villas and even big cities were a thing, the ancient Italian landscape was still reliant on agriculture, albeit at a much lower rate. The ancient Roman state was an agricultural polity, and before the great Rome we all know and love, the landscape was an amalgamation of peasant farmers and small settlements. Peasant farms are one of the earliest forms of habitation for ancient Italy. Often, communities grew as farms got closer or moved closer to each other for protection or via family connections. These would come to form towns and villages much later on, but for the sake of this video, let's start by looking at what life was like on a peasant farm. Part 1. Family life. Peasant farms were not the farms we usually think of today. They were small, family-based ways of survival. Most of the time there was a central family, a paterfamilias, the head male of the family, literally meaning the father of the family, a mother, children, and maybe some grandparents. Every member of the family worked on the farm. The boys would often do the agricultural work while the women tended the home. The paterfamilias was at the centre of the family. He was responsible for everything: education, health, general care, and finance. Mothers would teach their daughters how to take care of the house, and how to cook and forage for any food in the surrounding area. The children would not have had the same upbringing as children today. If they made it through the dangers of childbirth and infancy, then they would have begun working at a young age. They learnt how to farm, take care of animals, and do maintenance around the farm. As the children grew older, girls would often marry and move out, while the boys took over the farm and moved their wives to live with them. Often this expanded the farm, more land being converted into agricultural land, and more buildings constructed for the new families. Or alternatively, a couple may move to a nearby city or settlement, finding new careers or moving to start their new farm. In rare cases, some slaves may have lived with the family and worked the land. However, for the most part, it was the family who did this, as slaves were expensive, not only to buy, but also to keep, as you became responsible for feeding and maintaining their well-being. Part 2. The farm. Farmhouses were small and humble, usually consisting of a singular rectangular structure divided into 2 rooms. One room would likely have been a communal space, where the family lived, slept, cooked, performed crafts and took shelter. The other would most likely have been for storage or for other needs. Any animals kept on the farm would have lived in this building alongside the family in times when they needed shelter. Life in these farmhouses would have been far from luxury. They would be smoky from the central hearth, crowded from the people and animals, and likely wouldn't have been very clean. As time went on and families saved money or expanded their farms, we may see other structures appear for uses such as workshops or even baths. Part 3. Challenges. Farmers could face many challenges in their lifetime. Life was hard and not always predictable. Crop failure, natural disasters, drought, or attack by raiding parties could lead to famine and destruction of peasant farms. Since hygiene was also an issue living with the farm animals for much of the winter, disease would have been extremely dangerous, and with few ways to prevent or cure them, mortality would have been high. The most common challenge was when the men of the family went off to war with the Roman army. A lack of men to work the farms during the campaigning season could hinder crop and animal production, and if they died while away, then it could leave the farms vulnerable and the women of the family unable to provide for themselves. As time went on, the growing pressure of large villas buying land could see families forced from their farms and way of life, leading them to have to emigrate to a city or village in poverty. Being a peasant farmer was difficult. Part 4. Production. Unlike later villas, peasant farms usually only produced enough food and material to sustain themselves and their farm. Produce would have included things like grapes, cereal grain, olives, and a variety of other vegetables to provide sustenance to either the family or the animals that lived or worked on the farm. The majority of these farms would have included presses for olive oil or wine production. Cato the Elder even expresses that each farm should have 3 presses. The animals that were kept by these farmers would often include cows, sheep, goats, pigs, and oxen and mules for their heavy lifting and ploughing. Cows would mainly be used for milk production, while goats and sheep would produce cheese and fur hides. We may often think that horses were important, however these were mainly reserved for the rich and the aristocracy. In later Roman life, some farmers may even keep bees for producing honey or snails as a luxury good. But for the most part, peasant farmers were very basic in their production, and as previously mentioned, almost all goods that were produced were preserved to provide for the farmers and their families. not for profit. Profit was the last thought for a peasant farmer, and the priority was to provide for themselves. However, when there was an abundance of goods or extra produce that was not needed, trade would take place. Part 5. Trade. In these instances, farmers would travel to neighbouring farms, villages, or cities and trade their wares for money or other goods that they might need on the farm. These would usually be professionally made goods, ironwork for tools, or pottery that could not be produced by the farmer. Integration with the wider Roman economy eventually helped farms to expand and grow, even offering new employment opportunities for the children of the farmers so that they could go into professions other than farming. Something else that Rome relied on was an army. Many farmers were also soldiers who went off to war during the campaigning season. In fact, the campaigning season was marked around the agricultural season in order for farmers to return for harvests and planting. By travelling with the military, this broadened farmers' agricultural diversity, allowing them to bring new crops, practices, and trade connections to the Roman countryside. Part 6. Rural villages. Villages offered security and protection in numbers, as well as providing professional services like carpenters, blacksmiths, bakers, and various other craftsmen who they could buy or trade commodities with. Villages varied in size, commercial ability, economic opportunities, and social life, depending on where they were located. But for the majority of them, they were simple groups of buildings with various people and trades within. Conclusions. In all, rural life as a Roman was much different from the lavish luxury we usually think of today. It was a tough life, one of familial survival and hardship. However, as Rome went on to become the grand city and state that it did, rural life was praised and celebrated. It was the very roots of Rome, and later city folk strived to preserve their agricultural heritage, and owning a farm remained an important aspect of Roman culture. I hope you enjoyed this episode and tune in next time for the alternative end of rural Roman life, where we look at life in a real Roman villa.